David Carter sat quietly by the window, his eyes tracing the steady rise of the plane as it cut through the clouds, leaving behind the city that had just been a blur of motion. He wasn't in a hurry, nor was he particularly eager for any excitement. It had been a long week of business. And now, this flight was his time to rest, an unspoken agreement he had made with himself. This was supposed to be a simple journey home, the kind where you let your mind wander, where you give yourself permission to relax, to let go of the pressures of work, the grind of life. He adjusted his seat, feeling the gentle hum of the aircraft around him. The lights above flickered softly as passengers settled in. A stewardess passed by, offering the usual polite smile, her cart rolling quietly down the aisle. But as she glanced at David, there was something in her look, just a flicker, too quick to be fully identified, that made him pause. Rachel, that was her name. He had caught it when she had first introduced herself. A simple name, one that carried no particular weight, no special meaning, but now it was attached to the subtle feeling he had learned to recognize all too well over the years. The feeling that comes with being seen not for who you are, but for what others assume you to be. As she made her way down the aisle, she stopped just short of him. She was a few steps ahead of the row where he sat. But she hesitated for a moment, as if double-checking something. When she turned to face him, her smile was polite, but her eyes lingered only for a moment before they moved quickly away. David didn't immediately think much of it. He had learned, over the years, to let small things like that slide. But it wasn't just the smile or the way she looked at him. It was the silence that followed the uncomfortable pause that seemed to hang between them. As if there was something unsaid, something left out of the conversation that neither of them was willing to address. She carried on, walking past, her footsteps light but deliberate. David let out a small breath. Not a sigh, just a slow release of air, as though preparing himself for the rest of the flight. He had been through this before, of course. The slight, unnoticed ways people view him differently, the assumptions they make, the extra step of caution, the deliberate neutrality, or sometimes, the subtle avoidance. It wasn't new, not by any means. He had been dealing with it his entire life, on and off the clock. He had been a pilot for years. Yet when he wasn't in uniform, when he wasn't behind the cockpit, there was always the question, an unspoken one, of whether others saw him as someone who truly belonged. It was in moments like this, when the world was quiet, and the hum of the engine filled the space between thoughts, that David often wondered how much of his life had been shaped by those quiet, unnoticed moments of exclusion. How many conversations had he missed because of a glance, a smile, a hesitation? How many times had he been looked at, and not truly seen? The plane leveled out, and David shifted in his seat, staring ahead at the soft glow of the cabin lights. It wasn't anger that he felt, nor frustration, not exactly. It was more of a quiet understanding, a recognition that some things, some people, just don't see. They don't see you for who you are, for what you have become, for the work you've done, the life you've lived. They only see the surface. Rachel came back, this time closer to his seat. She asked if he needed anything. Her voice was steady, neutral, but the smile was still there, a little strained. She didn't ask anything about his job. Not that he would have volunteered the information. But he noticed that she didn't quite make eye contact. Not the kind that made you feel seen. That made you feel as though you mattered. It was more of a passing glance, like the motion of the wind that you barely register. Yet it still shapes the world around you. David nodded. Polite but distant. No, thank you, he said, his voice low but firm. He watched as she moved on. And then he let his thoughts drift. The plane's steady rhythm seemed to match his pace. For the moment, there was nothing more to do but wait. He couldn't change the world with a glance or a conversation. Not today, not right now, but perhaps, in the quiet of this flight, he could think about it. He could think about how it felt. The quiet tension that lingered in the air between them. In the end, it was just another flight. But it was also another moment. Another moment in the ongoing dance of misunderstanding, of unspoken thoughts, and of silent judgments. As the clouds passed outside the window, David leaned back in his seat, his thoughts still unsettled but moving, quietly, like the plane beneath him. The flight continued its steady course, slicing through the thin veil of clouds. David leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, the rhythmic hum of the engines grounding him in the quiet that enveloped the cabin. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, pale blue shifting to the soft hues of sunset. It was the kind of journey that demanded nothing of him, just time, space, and the brief respite that only air travel could provide. But the peace he sought was fragile, interrupted by the subtle reminders that, even in the calmest of places, certain things could never truly be silenced. Rachel passed by again, this time a little closer than before. Her eyes met his for a brief second, not quite meeting his gaze, but rather skimming over him as though trying to ascertain something in his presence. She offered the same neutral smile, though there was something forced about it now. He couldn't help but notice. There were no words exchanged, just the silence between them, a silence that felt louder than it should have. As she walked away, David watched her move down the aisle, pausing to speak to a few other passengers with ease, her voice warm and light. But the same warmth wasn't extended to him. He wasn't angry about it. No, it was something quieter, a weariness that had settled into his bones over the years. A weariness from knowing exactly how the story would unfold. It was the small things, he thought. The way people adjusted their posture when he stood. The way their expressions would soften when he spoke. A flash of discomfort, quickly hidden, quickly disguised. But it was there. It always was. It wasn't new. Not for him. It was a reality he had long since learned to navigate. Like learning the lay of a familiar road. Sometimes, it was so subtle that it could almost be mistaken for kindness. And other times, it felt as though the air around him had been thickened, just slightly, to make breathing a little harder. David was no stranger to the everyday ways in which racism showed itself. The moments that came not from overt hostility but from quiet, insidious things like the careful way Rachel avoided standing too close. The cautious undertones in her voice when she spoke to him. It wasn't that she was outright rude, it was something softer. An undertow of doubt in the way she looked at him, as though his being there was a small, inconvenient disruption to the order she was comfortable with. For years, David had grown accustomed to such things. He could feel it in the way people greeted him, in the way they asked questions that others would never be asked. The tone of voice that would shift ever so slightly when they realized he was more than just a passenger, when they realized he was someone who was meant to be in the cockpit. Someone who knew how to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But on a flight like this, there was no cockpit. There was only this seat, this space, and the weight of an invisible boundary that no one acknowledged but which was always there. He watched Rachel walk past again, offering drinks to other passengers, making her way back toward him. Her movements were smooth, practiced, but there was a slight hesitation in her steps as she reached his row. She paused just long enough to glance down at her cart, then quickly up at him. "Anything I can get you?" Her voice was polite, but her eyes remained steady on his hands, clasped quietly in his lap. David shook his head, his response soft. "No, thank you." There was a moment where neither of them spoke, where the silence stretched out for just a little too long. It was as though she was waiting for something, perhaps for him to say something else, or for her to justify the discomfort she was feeling. And he was, for a moment, tempted to say something, to challenge it, to ask why the question was even asked in that tone. But he knew better. He had learned better. Instead, he simply smiled, small and measured, and looked out the window again. Rachel didn't linger. She moved on quickly, her footsteps a little too quick, a little too practiced. David watched her disappear into the next cabin, the briefest feeling of being seen, of being acknowledged, fading away as quickly as it had come. The truth was, David didn't expect anything more from her. He didn't expect her to suddenly realize how wrong her assumptions were, or to understand the complexity of the things left unspoken between them. He didn't expect her to apologize, to acknowledge the quiet discomfort she had introduced into the space they shared. That wasn't how things worked. Not in the sky, and not on the ground, either. David sighed softly, his eyes still on the window, but his thoughts distant. It wasn't about her. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about the miles of silence, of these small, unnoticed moments, stretching out behind him, like a long, slow march. He knew, from experience, that things didn't change easily. Not in the grand schemes of life. Not when the world was full of invisible lines and unwritten rules that no one ever fully questioned. And so, he sat quietly in his seat, watching the clouds pass by, waiting for the flight to continue, knowing that the journey ahead would be more than just the miles between one airport and the next. It would be the journey of quietly bearing witness to the things that most people never see. The hours passed quietly, and the hum of the engines became a familiar backdrop to the soft rhythm of David's thoughts. The cabin was calm, the occasional chatter of passengers barely breaking through the air. Most people had settled into the routine of the flight, reading, dozing, or simply staring out the windows as the world moved beneath them. David found himself caught between two worlds: the physical world of the flight, with its steady, predictable movement, and the quiet turbulence within him, the quiet dissonance that had settled in ever since he had boarded. It wasn't the kind of thing that demanded attention, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, like a soft undercurrent that one couldn't escape, no matter how far they tried to drift. Rachel passed by again, but this time she lingered just a moment longer. Her eyes skimmed over the rows of passengers. But when they reached David's seat, they lingered only briefly. She seemed to hesitate, just enough to make him notice. Before she moved on, no words passed between them. Not this time. She had become careful, cautious even, but David could feel the unspoken distance between them. It wasn't just the formality of her gestures, the practiced politeness with which she moved, that unsettled him. It was the way she seemed to approach him with a certain wariness. As though every action was measured, every word considered. He had seen it before. This careful dance that people performed when they weren't quite sure how to navigate the space between them. When they were uncertain of how to treat him, or if they should treat him at all. David sat still, his gaze drifting to the window. Though his thoughts were far from the distant view outside, there was something about this flight, about this moment, that felt different from all the others. It was as if the whole cabin had been laced with a quiet tension that none of the passengers fully acknowledged. Yet it held them all in its grip. The flight attendants continued their rounds, serving drinks and offering snacks, the hum of their voices blending with the constant low drone of the engines. Rachel, now a few rows away, had resumed her task with the same efficiency, moving from one passenger to the next. But there was something about her movements that felt almost mechanical, as though she were moving through the motions without fully engaging with the world around her. David didn't mind the quiet. He had always preferred it, the space it allowed for reflection. But as the minutes ticked by, he began to notice the way people glanced at him, not with curiosity, but with something else, a hesitation, the subtle shift in posture when they saw him, the polite but guarded smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to and named. But it was there, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of difference that never seemed to fade. He had grown used to it over the years, the way people saw him, or didn't see him, as a person first, the way his presence in any space seemed to carry an extra weight. An invisible burden that no one else had to bear. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be corrected with a conversation or a stern look. It was woven into the fabric of the everyday. It was there in the glances, the unasked questions, the polite silence. But as much as David had learned to navigate this quiet tension, it was hard to ignore it now. He had long ago accepted the subtle discomfort, the underlying friction that existed between him and so many others. But that didn't mean he was blind to it, or that it didn't sometimes weigh on him more than he cared to admit. There were days when it felt like an invisible hand was resting on his shoulder, just enough to make him aware of his difference. As the flight cruised on, David allowed himself a moment of rest, his eyes closing briefly, his mind shifting away from the uncomfortable awareness of his surroundings. But just as the stillness seemed to settle, the intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice breaking through the calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been notified of a medical emergency on board. We're going to need to make some adjustments. Please stay calm and remain seated." The announcement was simple, almost matter of fact, but it carried with it a weight that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. Passengers began to stir, murmurs spreading through the rows. David opened his eyes, feeling the tension in the airshift. But he remained seated, his hands resting in his lap. His mind shifting from the quiet discomfort of the flight to the new reality unfolding around him. He watched as the flight attendants, including Rachel, moved quickly down the aisle, their faces set in the professional mask that only years of training could perfect. There was no panic in their movements, no hint of hesitation, but there was a sense of urgency in the air now, something that hadn't been there before. David waited, watching. He could feel the change in the air, the sudden shift in the mood of the passengers, the way people looked around at one another. Uncertain, expectant, the stillness that had settled over the cabin was gone now, replaced by a subtle unease that hung in the air. As Rachel passed by again, this time with a look of quiet determination, their eyes met briefly. For a moment, it felt like the distance between them had closed, just enough to acknowledge the moment. And yet, even now, there was something in the way she looked at him, something that remained unsaid. Just out of reach. David didn't respond. He simply nodded once, his gaze steady. The time for words, for explanations, had passed. It was time to act. The situation on the plane had shifted from calm to something more palpable. Though the quiet hum of the engines never wavered, the announcement had come and gone. But the unease lingered. David could feel the change in the atmosphere, the way the collective breath of the passengers seemed to hold, waiting for something they couldn't name, but sensed was coming. Rachel's movements were quicker now, more urgent. Her face, which had carried the faintest trace of wariness just moments before, was now focused, set in the mask of professionalism that was expected in moments of crisis. She moved down the aisle with purpose, speaking briefly to passengers, offering reassurances that were meant to be heard but not fully believed. The plane had shifted into a new rhythm. The usual noise of the cabin, the steady murmur of voices, the clink of trays being collected had quieted to a low, almost respectful murmur. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes scanning the rows, seeking understanding from one another, but finding little. David remained in his seat, his hands now folded in his lap, his mind sharp, alert. He had seen moments like this before, had trained for them. There was no panic in him, no rushing, no scrambling to act. He had always believed that in moments of crisis, the only thing that mattered was the clarity of your mind, the steadiness of your hand. It wasn't long before a voice crackled through the intercom. The captain, calm but measured, spoke to the cabin. "We're experiencing a medical emergency. We need to prepare for an emergency landing. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." David didn't need to hear more. He knew what was coming. The plane would make a quick descent, and the crew would need all hands on deck to ensure the safety of everyone aboard. His eyes moved toward the cockpit, but he stayed in his seat, watching Rachel now, who had already moved into the galley with a few of her colleagues, speaking in low voices. It was then that the door to the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped out, his face unreadable. His eyes scanned the cabin before they fell on David. The captain hesitated for just a second, his gaze lingering on David's face. In that brief moment, the quiet, unnoticed tension of the previous hours seemed to fold into itself, as though both men were waiting for something neither of them fully acknowledged. "David," the captain said, his voice low, "we need help in the cockpit. If you're willing, I could use your expertise." David nodded without hesitation. He had been waiting for this moment. It wasn't that he hadn't known it would come, it always did. In one form or another, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. He could feel the weight of the captain's words, the small shift in the dynamics between them. The captain was asking for help, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he recognized that there was a moment when things had to be done differently. David stood, slowly, deliberately. The motion felt almost too loud in the stillness of the cabin. His legs were steady, his movements calculated. He stepped into the aisle, and for a moment, the eyes of the passengers were on him, those familiar, cautious glances, the ones that weren't entirely trusting, the ones that lingered a little too long. It wasn't fear in their eyes. Not exactly, but it was uncertainty, the kind that came from being forced to confront something they weren't used to seeing. A man who wasn't a part of the typical narrative, The one who didn't fit the box they had put him in. David walked past Rachel, who was now standing near the galley. Her posture stiff, her eyes darting briefly to his face. He caught the small shift in her expression. The fleeting moment of something, perhaps surprise. Perhaps something more difficult to name. It was enough for him to notice. But he didn't acknowledge it. There was no time for that. He continued down the aisle toward the cockpit, each step bringing him closer to what he knew would be a series of decisions that would shape the course of the flight. The space between him and the cockpit seemed to grow smaller with each step. But David's mind was already working ahead. In the cockpit, the captain was waiting. His hands were steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments in front of him. "We need to bring the plane down," the captain said, his voice calm but with a hint of strain. "I need you to take over the controls while I handle the landing procedures. Can you guide us in?" David nodded again, but this time, there was something different in the gesture. A subtle shift that went unnoticed by the others in the room. But that David could feel deep in his chest. The air around them had changed. The invisible divide between them, the divide that had existed for the past few hours, was no longer there. In its place was something simpler. Something far more real. "Let's get it done," David said quietly. His voice was steady, calm, but inside, there was an awareness of something larger. Something more significant than just the task ahead of them. For a brief moment, the world outside the cockpit seemed to fade. The emergency, the uncertainty, the turbulence, they all seemed to belong to someone else. Somewhere else. In that small space, with the plane beneath him and the captain beside him, there was only the sound of his voice, steady and unwavering, and the quiet hum of the engines as they made their descent. Rachel had watched David walk past her, had seen him step into the cockpit. Her hand was resting on the galley counter, her fingers curling slightly, though she didn't seem to notice. She had seen him before. Yes. But never like this. Never in this role. In this light. It was an odd thing. How quickly a moment could change. How quickly perception could shift when it was no longer about what you assumed, but what you saw right in front of you. David's hands moved with precision as he adjusted the controls. His fingers light and steady. The cockpit felt oddly still. The air inside it thick with concentration. Yet there was a quiet kind of peace in the movement. His eyes scanned the instruments before him, each one telling a story that only a few understood. For him, this was second nature, a process he had performed countless times in the past. The calm was not a reflection of his nerves, but rather the absence of unnecessary thoughts. Everything was clear. The captain, sitting beside him, was equally calm, his face focused but not tense. They worked in tandem, each knowing their part without the need for words. The urgency of the situation, real though it was tempered by their years of training. Their shared experience in the air. In moments like this, there was no room for doubt. They both understood the gravity of what was happening, but neither allowed it to take over. They did what they were trained to do. Outside the cockpit, the plane was shaking gently, a reminder of the weather that lay ahead. But inside, there was a quiet steadiness that came from years of practice, of learning how to trust the systems around you. There was a rhythm to this, a certain order that had long ago replaced the chaos of other situations. And yet, despite the rhythm, despite the routine, something felt different this time. David's mind, usually clear and focused on the task at hand, kept drifting back to the interactions from earlier. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be called out as blatant prejudice, but rather the subtle, insidious kind of bias that sat in the air like dust. Unseen but always there. He could feel it even now, as he adjusted the controls, as he worked alongside the captain, who was now occasionally glancing over at him. He had known what it would be like when the captain had called him to help. It wasn't that he doubted his skills, it was that the captain had called him at all. There had been that brief moment, that hesitation, as the captain looked at him, his eyes not quite meeting David's, his expression unreadable. David had seen that look before. It wasn't one of hostility, but of something else, a recognition of something the captain wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. In that brief, pregnant pause before the captain spoke, David had understood that this was not just about the emergency at hand. It was about something far older, far deeper. It was about navigating a space where David's very presence, his very being, didn't quite fit the mold others had in mind. The captain's voice broke through his thoughts, low and steady as he spoke, his words carrying a subtle tension. "We'll need to make the final descent in a few minutes," the captain said. "You'll need to guide us in. I'll monitor the landing gear." David nodded, his response automatic. "Understood." His voice was calm, but there was a faint awareness beneath the surface. A sense that things had shifted. Though nothing had been said directly, his mind was not entirely on the task at hand. It was moving in two directions, one on the plane, on the instruments, on the landing procedure, but the other was concerned with something else. Something he had little control over. David didn't need to say it out loud. The space in the cockpit was enough. The way the captain had spoken, the slight hesitation in his voice, it was a small thing. But it mattered. He didn't need to wonder if the captain trusted him. The question was always there, simmering beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. It had always been there. And in that moment, when it was most needed, the captain had chosen to trust him. There was no time to reflect on it fully. No time to examine the nuances of it all. The task was too urgent. The air outside the cockpit was growing thick with the changing conditions of the weather. And the plane was beginning its gradual descent. The cockpit was small, contained, but it was enough for David to focus. This was the moment when clarity mattered. It didn't matter who sat beside him. Didn't matter who thought what. There was only the plane, the systems, and the people on board. As the instruments indicated they were nearing the airport, David's hands moved swiftly and confidently. He adjusted the speed, the altitude, every motion controlled. Deliberate. Outside, the clouds had darkened, the sky now an ominous gray as they descended further. But David remained calm. The world outside was becoming less predictable, less controllable. But inside the cockpit, everything was measured. For a brief moment, David's eyes flickered to the captain. The captain's gaze met his. And there it was, the faintest flicker of something. It wasn't quite acknowledgement, but it was more than just routine. The captain didn't say anything. But in that brief exchange, there was a silent recognition. Not just of David's competence, but of his presence, of what it meant for David to be here. In this role, at this moment. It wasn't a dramatic thing. Not a grand gesture. But it mattered. The words they didn't speak hung between them like an understanding that was never fully formed but was always there. A thread that ran through their interactions. The landing gear was confirmed. The runway stretched out ahead of them. And the moment of decision had arrived. David's focus tightened. Everything else, everything outside the cockpit, everything that had been said, unsaid, faded into the background. There was only the task at hand. Rachel had been moving through the cabin, her expression now one of practiced calm. But there was something else behind her eyes as she glanced at the cockpit once more. She had seen David leave the cabin, had watched him step into the cockpit with a purpose that was hard to ignore. And now, as she moved through the aisles, serving passengers, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The subtle change in the way things were unfolding was not lost on her. It wasn't just the emergency, the landing. It was the understanding that, somehow, the space between them, between her and David, had changed. If only for a moment. The unease, the subtle distance, the hesitation now. There was something different, something quietly acknowledged. And so, as the plane continued its descent, David's hands moved with purpose. Each decision made without hesitation. There was no space for doubt in these final moments. There was only the clarity of purpose, the knowledge that, no matter what had come before, this moment required focus, skill, and something deeper, something beyond the routine. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The landing had been smooth. Far smoother than it should have been given the urgency of the situation. The plane touched down gently on the runway, its wheels making a soft, reassuring thrum against the tarmac as it slowed, coming to a stop at the gate. The immediate tension in the cockpit lifted, replaced by a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. David sat back in his seat, his hands still resting lightly on the controls as the final descent completed. His eyes were momentarily fixed on the instruments, but his thoughts had drifted, as they often did in moments like this. to something outside of the immediate task at hand. The emergency was over, the passengers safe, but there remained something in the air. Something unspoken, like the distant hum of the engines still lingering long after they had been turned off. The captain spoke first, his voice calm but with an edge of gratitude. "Good work, David. You handled it well." David nodded, his response quiet but sincere. "Thank you." There was little else to say. The crew had done their job. The passengers had been kept safe. And the plane had landed without incident. But as David stood and began to move toward the door, there was a strange, almost surreal feeling that lingered in the space. It wasn't quite a sense of triumph. Nor was it relief. It was simply recognition. For a brief moment, in the cockpit, there had been no room for assumptions. No room for anything other than the task before them. And in that small space, the dynamic between David and the captain had shifted. Subtly, but undeniably. David walked down the aisle, his movements steady but measured. He glanced at the passengers as he passed, noticing the quiet shift in their demeanor. There was no applause, no overt recognition, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been different about this flight. The tension that had been present earlier had dissipated. And now, in its place, there was a new, unspoken understanding. Rachel stood by the galley, her posture slightly more relaxed than it had been earlier, though her expression still carried a certain reserved professionalism. She glanced up as David approached, her eyes meeting his with a kind of careful neutrality. There was something in her gaze that had changed since earlier in the flight, something softer. Perhaps, or maybe just less guarded. David paused for a moment, his gaze holding hers. The moment felt almost too quiet, too still, but it was one that needed to happen. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for words. The change had been subtle, but it was there. He could see it in the way she didn't look away immediately, in the way her stance shifted just slightly, as though something inside her had adjusted, as if she was finally seeing him not as an idea or a stereotype, but as someone who had been a part of the journey, who had been integral to the outcome. Rachel's voice was soft when she spoke, her tone more open than before. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your help." David nodded, acknowledging the words without needing to add anything more. He didn't need her gratitude, it was the recognition itself that mattered. The small shift, the quiet understanding that had settled in the space between them. It wasn't about vindication, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about the quiet acknowledgement that, perhaps, things didn't need to be as complicated as they had seemed. For a moment, there was only the soft murmur of passengers gathering their things, the shuffle of bags and the quiet hum of conversations that were beginning to resume. The plane had come to a stop. The emergency was over, but something had changed, something had shifted, not just in the flight, but in the small, often unnoticed spaces between people. David didn't linger. There was no need for him to stay. No need to force the moment. He had done his part. And now the rest was up to them. He moved toward the door, his steps quiet but sure, the weight of the flight lifting off his shoulders with each step. There was nothing dramatic about it, no sense of closure, no triumphant moment, just the soft release of tension, the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing you had done what was necessary. As he stepped out into the terminal, the world outside seemed a little brighter, though not by much. The sun was beginning to dip behind the clouds, casting long shadows over the airport. But David didn't mind. He wasn't thinking about the larger world. Not now. For the first time in a long time. He wasn't thinking about the weight of what had been said or unsaid. He was simply moving forward, knowing that in this moment, the smallest of things had shifted. And perhaps, that was enough. The plane had long since come to a full stop at the gate. Its engines now quiet, the rhythmic hum of flight replaced by the soft murmur of passengers gathering their belongings. The overhead lights flickered on, and the usual bustle of deplaning began. But there was something about this particular moment that felt different. It wasn't the emergency landing. Not exactly. It wasn't the nerves that had fluttered at the start of the descent, nor the relief that came once the plane had touched down safely. It was the quiet weight of the unspoken, the things that had hung between the passengers, the crew, and even between him and Rachel. It was the subtle recognition of something that had shifted. Not just in the space they had shared, but in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. David stood by the exit, watching as passengers filed out, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. There were no grand gestures. No applause for the man who had helped land the plane. There was no need for any of that. The crew had done their part. The flight attendants had worked their jobs. And the plane had landed safely. The work had been done. And now it was over. But for David, there was a quiet sense of fulfillment. A soft satisfaction that came not from the recognition of his actions, but from the shift that had occurred. It was the feeling of being seen not as a symbol, not as an outsider, but as a part of the whole. As someone whose contributions had mattered. Whose presence had made a difference in ways that couldn't always be measured. Rachel passed by him again. Her movements purposeful but not hurried. There was no tension in the air this time. No awkwardness. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. She didn't look at him with the same guarded expression as before. There was something softer in her eyes now. Something that had opened up in the hours since the flight began. She stopped briefly, just a few feet away from him. Her hands were still busy, collecting her belongings from the overhead bin. But she spoke quietly, her voice calm, measured. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a hint of sincerity that hadn't been there before. David nodded, his gaze steady. It wasn't a moment that required a response. She had said what needed to be said. And he understood. He had never needed her thanks. What had mattered was the change in the space between them. The shift that had come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet recognition of one another's humanity. He moved past her, his steps slow, thoughtful. The terminal was filled with the usual sounds of people rushing to and fro. But for him, it felt as though time had slowed. Just for a moment, the weight of the past few hours, the tension, the discomfort, the quiet moments of doubt had settled into something else now. Something quieter, something that, in its own way, felt like progress. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. The flight had ended, but the journey wasn't over. There would be other flights. Other moments of quiet tension. Other chances for small, unspoken shifts. But for now, the world felt a little lighter. He had done his part. Not just in the cockpit, but in the moments that had passed. In the small, unnoticed ways he had contributed to something larger than himself. He stepped into the crowd, his figure blending into the flow of passengers. And for the first time in a long while, David felt like he was simply another person in the crowd. Not an outsider, not a symbol, but a person, a man who had been seen, who had been acknowledged, in a way that mattered, in a way that was quiet, but real. And as he walked through the terminal, David thought about the way things had shifted, how a small moment of recognition had rippled through the people around him. There had been no grand gesture, no immediate change in the world, but perhaps, in these small moments, in these quiet exchanges, there was the beginning of something else. Something better. And that, he thought, was enough for now. The terminal was quieter now. The crowd thinning as the last of the passengers filtered out into the waiting areas. The low murmur of conversation. The occasional announcement over the loudspeaker. And the shuffle of feet on the polished floors made the space feel like any other airport. But for David, it felt different. He had been here before. Of course, many times. The long corridors, the familiar din of travelers rushing to and fro, the bustle of another day's work completed. Another flight landed, but today, there was something new in the air, something soft and subtle that had settled over him in the hours since the plane had touched down. It wasn't a dramatic change, not one that could be pinpointed in a single moment. It was quieter than that, slower than that. It had crept up on him like the fading light of day. Unnoticed at first but undeniable once it had taken hold. David moved through the terminal with the ease of someone who had long since learned the rhythm of travel. His bag slung over his shoulder. His steps steady. His gaze focused ahead but not hurrying. There was no rush now. No need to hurry. The day had unfolded in its own time. And now, there was only the journey home. He passed a few familiar faces along the way. Faces that were vaguely recognizable but meant little in the grand scheme of things. The usual small talk, the polite nods, the brief exchanges that marked the passage of strangers through the same spaces. But David didn't feel like a stranger today. Not in the way he usually did. Today, he felt as though the space around him had expanded, softened, as though the walls that had once kept him at a distance from those around him had, for a moment, given way. As he neared the exit, David glanced back toward the terminal gates. The flight, with all its tension, its quiet struggles, had come to an end. The passengers had left, the crew had finished their duties, and Rachel, who had, just hours before, looked at him with skepticism and caution, was now nowhere in sight. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that for the briefest of moments, the world had been different. People had been different. David stepped outside into the cool air, the gentle breeze carrying with it the scents of the city. The sky above was beginning to darken, the soft hues of twilight spreading across the horizon. The evening was calm, the world still, as though it, too, had taken a pause to reflect. It wasn't a grand gesture. Not the kind of change that could be seen immediately or celebrated with loud applause. No, it was the kind of shift that was quieter, more subtle, something that wouldn't be recognized by most. But that was felt in the small moments. In the way people looked at each other. In the way they chose to acknowledge the humanity that connected them. David didn't feel like a hero today. He didn't feel like anything extraordinary had happened. But he did feel something deeper than the weight of any injustice he had ever experienced. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the lines between people hadn't been so sharply drawn. For once, the world hadn't divided itself along the lines of race, of assumption, of unspoken prejudice. In that moment, he had been seen not for the color of his skin or the job he held, but for what he had done, what he had contributed to the safety of everyone on that plane. He didn't expect the world to change overnight. He didn't expect Rachel, or anyone else for that matter, to suddenly see things differently. But in those brief moments, when the plane was in the air and the crisis had unfolded, he had proven something, not just to her, not just to the passengers, but to himself. David paused for a moment as he stood on the steps of the airport, looking out over the city. The streets were just beginning to light up, the hum of life still carrying on, unaware of the small shifts that had occurred in the spaces between people. The journey home was never as simple as just getting from one place to another. There were always moments along the way, small, quiet moments that carried more weight than the destination itself. The small acknowledgements, the small gestures, the quiet shifts in how people see one another. David's journey wasn't over. Not really. There would always be more flights, more moments, more places where the same quiet struggles would play out. But for now, he could rest. For now, the weight of it all had lessened, if only by a little. And that was enough. As he turned and walked toward the taxi stand, the soft click of his shoes against the pavement was the only sound that marked his departure. There was no need for anything more, no applause, no fanfare, just the quiet movement of someone continuing on their way, knowing that, for a moment, they had made a difference. Not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of being seen. And sometimes, that was enough.